200 feet below the streets of Moscow lies a city that shouldn't exist. It was built for a world that had already ended. There is a place beneath Moscow that was never meant to be seen. No sunlight reaches it, no wind, no seasons, only concrete, steel, and silence. If you were standing in Red Square at the height of the Cold War, you were walking on top of a tomb designed for the living. It was not built to save people, it was built to save power. Deep below the capital of the Soviet Union, engineers carved out a hidden city for a future they believed was inevitable, a future where nuclear fire erased the surface and only the state remained. But how do you build a city 200 feet underground without anyone noticing? And what happened to the men who were ordered to stay below while their families were left above? To understand this place, we have to return to a time when the world wasn't just afraid of the end, it was preparing for it. In the early years of the Cold War, Soviet leadership accepted something most civilians never truly understood. They did not treat nuclear war as a distant possibility, they treated it as a future that had to be planned for. American bombers could cross the Arctic in hours. Intercontinental missiles could arrive in minutes. Early warning systems were unreliable. Communications could be severed instantly. Soviet war planners believed that in a full-scale exchange, Moscow would likely be among the first targets. If the Kremlin and military headquarters were destroyed, the country would lose its command structure in seconds. And without command, there would be no coordination, no retaliation, no control. Entire centuries of Russian history could vanish in a single morning. So the question was not how to prevent war. The question was, where does the government go when Moscow dies? The answer was buried beneath the city itself, but the challenge was scale. You cannot secretly construct a replacement capital beneath one of the busiest cities on Earth. Officially, construction crews were expanding the Moscow metro system. The public saw magnificent subway stations with marble floors and chandeliers, the so-called palaces of the people. But while commuters admired mosaics and murals, deeper crews were working far below them. Tons of earth were removed under the cover of night. Construction schedules were disguised as routine subway expansion. Teams were separated so no group ever saw the full design. One team poured concrete, another installed ventilation, another laid communications cables. No one had the full map. By the mid-1950s, the underground city was complete. It would later be known as Bunker 42. More than 60 meters underground, a sealed complex was carved into solid rock. This was not a single chamber. It was a network of 4 massive interconnected steel tubes, each 150 meters long and as wide as a 2-story house. Engineers understood something terrifying about nuclear war. A nearby blast would not just destroy buildings, it would cause the ground itself to behave like liquid. Rigid structures would shatter as the earth turned into a tidal wave of rock and soil. So the bunker was not simply anchored to the stone. Its walls were reinforced with thick concrete and lined with 18-millimeter thick steel plates. But the secret weapon was the shock-absorbing supports. Key sections of the bunker were mounted on colossal, heavy-duty springs and dampers. If a 5-megaton warhead detonated above, the bunker was designed to float and flex within the earth. It would bounce while the world above shattered. To keep the 3,000 residents alive, the air they breathed didn't come from the street. It was sucked through massive intake vents, passed through chemical scrubbers to remove carbon dioxide, and filtered through silver-impregnated charcoal to catch radioactive isotopes. The lights were powered by massive marine diesel engines, the same kind used in Soviet submarines. If the power grid of Moscow failed, these engines would roar to life, vibrating through the very floorboards the officers stood on. It was a loud, hot, and claustrophobic environment. The walls were painted a pale, sterile green, a color Soviet psychologists believed would keep the men from losing their minds in the absence of a horizon. But the question remained, who was actually allowed inside this steel tomb? This is where the story turns dark. Bunker 42 was never meant for civilians. It was not a shelter for families, not a refuge for workers. It was built for generals, party officials, and communications officers. It was a continuity of command. In the Soviet mindset, the survival of individuals was secondary. The survival of the structure was everything. Inside, they recreated a stripped-down version of normal life. There were kitchens stocked with canned rations, mostly tushonka, a fatty stewed pork, and vacuum-sealed bread designed to stay soft for years. There were medical rooms with basic surgical equipment and dormitories filled with metal bunks.
But life here was psychologically grueling. Because there was no sun, men lost track of time within 48 hours. The clocks had to be specially synchronized, and a day-night lighting cycle was enforced just to prevent total mental collapse. In the command halls, enormous maps of the Soviet Union covered the walls, not because the country would still exist, but because orders would still be issued. Imagine an officer seated at a radio console during the Cuban Missile Crisis. His headset crackles with static. He knows that if the signal dies, it means the city above him, his home, his wife, his children, may already be gone. But his instructions are clear. Remain at the station, maintain communications, coordinate the response. They were expected to govern a cemetery. But how would leaders reach the bunker in time? If missiles were only minutes away, there was no time for traffic or surface evacuation. This leads to one of the most persistent legends in Moscow, Metro 2. For decades, rumors spoke of a second subway system buried deeper than the public one, a secret railway connecting the Kremlin to military headquarters, intelligence agencies, and leadership bunkers like Bunker 42. It was allegedly known by the code name D6. For most of the Cold War, officials denied it existed, but after the Soviet collapse, diggers, urban explorers, began finding strange things. They found blocked tunnels with no station names, heavy blast doors behind ordinary service rooms, single-track railways vanishing into darkness that didn't appear on any municipal map. The logic was simple. If the government was going to rule from underground, it needed its own private road to get there. For decades, Bunker 42 remained on standby. The diesel generators were tested weekly. The air filtration systems were run to ensure they could still scrub radioactive dust. Officers rehearsed emergency procedures again and again. They lived in a permanent state of almost. In October 1962, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, the bunker reached its most terrifying moment. The facility was placed on high alert. Thousands of officers were funneled through the secret entrances. The blast doors were prepared to seal. For 13 days, the men inside lived with their fingers literally hovering over the communication switches that would authorize the end of the world. They waited for a phone call. Not a call for peace, but a call that would mean the surface was lost. But then, the world changed, but not the way the bunker was built for. By the late 1980s, the Soviet economy was collapsing, political control weakened, the fear of nuclear war faded, replaced by internal instability. And in 1991, the Soviet Union did not end with fire. It ended with paperwork. The bunker was suddenly a command center with no country. The officers remained. The safes still held codes. The maps still hung on the walls. But the nation they represented had vanished overnight. For years, much of the complex was abandoned. Equipment that once represented the height of Cold War technology sat dark. Control panels gathered dust. Corridors echoed with nothing but ventilation fans. In 2006, the facility was declassified and sold to a private company. Today, visitors can descend into it. They walk the same corridors where Soviet leaders expected to spend their final days. They see radiation warning signs, propaganda posters, communication consoles. They can even see the famous red button. But what they cannot see is the fear that built this place. We think of bunkers as shelters, but Bunker 42 is a monument to a different idea.
It was not built to preserve civilization. It was built to preserve authority. Even if the surface became a graveyard, the bureaucracy would still grieve. And Bunker 42 was not alone. The Soviet Union built other leadership shelters across the country. Some were hidden beneath mountains in the Urals, like the massive Mount Yamontau complex, which is rumored to be large enough to house 60,000 people and is still being maintained today. Some remain sealed, some remain classified, some may still be unknown, hidden beneath forests or disguised as ordinary industrial facilities, each one built on the same principle. The world can die, the state must not. Do you think these extinction bunkers are still being maintained in secret today? Or has the world finally moved past the idea of ruling the ruins? Tell me what you think in the comments. What remains of Bunker 42 is a contradiction. It was meant to outlast cities. It was meant to become the capital of a burned nation, but it could not outlast the system that created it. The nuclear war never came. The Soviet Union did. Above it, Moscow thrives. Cars crowd the streets, tourists fill Red Square. Life continues in sunlight. Below it, the backup capital waits in silence. No generals, no launch codes, no war rooms. Just empty halls built for a future that never arrived. This place was meant to rule the ruins, but the ruins never came. And now, all that remains is a buried city that prepared for the end of the world and was defeated by history instead.